I'm Paul Betts, a member of the History faculty and the Director of the European Studies Center. So I'm really speaking to you tonight in my capacity as chair of the Oxford Center of European History. So I'm going to begin with some thanks. First to the Oxford Center of European History and the committee, and particularly Garon Stamberg, who of course has helped organize this event. Also to Faisal Devji, the director of the Center for Global and Imperial History, which is also co-sponsored this event. So thanks to both of you, and of course to Julie Adams and Wally Zadasi here. Thank you for also the great organization you have to kind of get us this far with the event. Thank you very, very much for that. Okay, so it's my great pleasure then, in a sense, to turn to our main event. Great pleasure to introduce Shel Garon, who is a Nissan Professor of Japanese Studies and a Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton. He has published widely on East Asian history, especially on Japan, one of the leading figures in this field for decades. His first book was called The State and Labor in Modern Japan, published in 1987. Tracked the relationship among the labor movement, bureaucracy, and political parties as a case study of modern Japan's social order from the late 19th century to the present. He then followed that up with a second book on molding Japanese minds, the state in everyday life, published in 1997. And this was a kind of shift of focus in which he was looking at women's groups and middle-class activists and how they worked with the state to create a new sense of kind of political community since the late 19th century. Both of these works are as in standard in the field. They're widely reviewed, in a sense, attest to Shel's status in the field. Now, at this point, you may think you partly kind of walked into the wrong lecture theater, and that the Center for European History has invited a Japanese specialist to give our annual lecture. But in fact, we've invited him precisely because he's doing a lot of very new and interesting work on transnational history. At the moment, he's writing a comparative history of the home fronts in Japan, Germany, Britain in the Second World War. He's heading up an ERC funded 5-year project at Sciences Po in Paris, in which he's got 7 postdocs involved in that. We're doing this very, very large research project in terms of revisiting the role and structure of the home fronts in the Second World War. This study will no doubt become one in which you'll be working on the kind of the planning and the way these regimes cope with the experience of aerial warfare during the Second World War. I should say that this was Shel's, it's not his first foray into transnational history. In his third book, called Beyond Our Means, Why America Spends While the World Saves, published in 2012, it's an international history of consumerism. And in that book, he explores America's great divergence from both Europe and Asia, with a focus on American attitudes toward consumer spending and savings as stories of U.S. exceptionalism in its own right. It's kind of elegantly written transnational history of social values across 3 continents. But today's focus is on his new work on the home front in a broad comparative context. He's already published several articles from this project, probably most famously his piece that appeared in Past and Present in 2020 on the transnational destruction of cities, what Japan and the United States learned from the bombing of Britain and Germany in the Second World War. And in that piece, he shows not only how these home fronts were connected in terms of strategy and experience, but also how knowledge was used to defend against aerial warfare, and how it's widely circulated among the belligerents. I mean, for example, before the war, German military experts gathered information from British, French, and Soviet air defense and evacuation of children, while many foreign delegations, including from Japan, visited Germany to study bomb shelters and air raid protection. The point is that aerial warfare became one of the grim signatures, of course, of 20th century warfare. And it's also one in which the new techniques of prosecuting war meant that civil defense became a source of transnational learning. What Shel is setting out to do is, in a sense, to reconnect an already connected global war in new ways. And he's doing so in the face of a historiographical tendency to confine the experience of the home front within the stories of individual nations and national mythologies. So on behalf of the Oxford Center of European History and the Center for Global and Period History, it is my great pleasure to introduce you tonight as this year's annual lecture. Please, Shel.
Thank you very much, Paul, and also thanks to Faisal. Oh, that's okay, great. I haven't met, who is the director of the Center for Global History and Imperial History, for sponsoring this event. And I'm delighted and honored that you've all turned out. And I'm very honored to be your annual lecturer on European history, which you'll see I know a little bit about. So, and I'm going to be connecting tonight. Okay, so let me start by just very quickly laying out the context of my ERC project. And for those who, I guess the UK is a little bit outside of it now, although you are back in. ERC is European Research Council, so it's part of the EU research apparatus. I'm currently based in Paris, hosted by Sciences Po, the Centre d'Histoire, and I'm directing, it's a 5-year project, and it's called, so just to show, I think since Paul and I talked, I don't know, the more resources I got, the bigger the project became. So it's not just aerial bombardment, it's not just home front. It is called The Global War on Civilians. Okay, it's a grandiose title, but I think it works. It's basically the first half of the 20th century. I'm not going to talk about the periodization. We can come back to that. But the important thing is what it covers and what its central questions are. So it covers my specialty of Japan, of course. It covers a pretty much ignored war in global history, Japan, the Second Sino-Japanese War that starts in 1937 between Japan and China. It covers more conventional cases like Germany, Britain, France. Again, a little less covered in the global history context is the Spanish Civil War, fascist Italy, fascist Italy's home front, which at least in the English language historiography doesn't appear too much, the Soviet Union home front, international law on war and civilians, a big topic still with us today, and finally the United States, where I don't do the home front, but you could say in sort of Hollywood terms, the U.S. makes a cameo appearance as the bomber and the blockader. And so it's a very important case as well. So there are many questions that we're exploring, but the central question, I would say, is a very timely one. And it's up there on the board. How did it become normal in the course of the first half of the 20th century for nations to seek to win wars, not simply by defeating armies and navies, but also by attacking the enemy's cities and civilians? Big question. And to handle it, we're not just doing a comparative history, we're doing, as Paul said, a transnational or a connected history. And we are arguing that this, what we call the global war on civilians, resulted from a long process of transnational learning as states investigated each other's strategies to target civilians, and at the same time as nation states sought to construct so-called home fronts to mobilize and protect their civilians at home. So the focus is a very broad one. Aerial bombardment is certainly the most spectacular of the 3 areas we're talking about. But we're also dealing with each of these, the elements I'm going to talk about, in both an offensive and a defensive capacity. So aerial bombardment on one hand, but as Paul said, civil defense against aerial bombardment at home. Second, blockades, which have certainly come back into the news. Blockades of the civilian food supply on the offense, and on the defense, home front programs to deal with the food scarcities. Production of more food, conservation of food, particularly the rationing of food. And the final category, the one we're going to talk about today, is this broad category, the strange phenomenon called civilian morale. We're going to look at offensive efforts to demoralize enemy civilians while at home boosting the morale of your people. So We're going to be talking about the third one today, morale, both in offensive and defensive capacities. And by this point, you may be well wondering, what in the world is morale? And the answer is, well, as late as the Second World War, strategists around the world couldn't define morale at all. But as an American Supreme Court justice once said of hardcore pornography, they knew it when they saw it. You're going to see there's a remarkable fuzziness in this story of morale. Remarkably, the importance of morale is you can actually look at how it's operationalized, particularly on the British side. Some of you may know this story, but by 1941, the British High Command actually prioritized as their number one target the morale of the German people. Not oil refineries, not transportation, not munitions factories, but the morale of the German people. And you don't need to look at this whole document, but again, it comes from the British Chiefs of Staff the same year, 1941. And the interesting thing is how they regard morale. The morale of the German people, it's something that's extremely fragile, brittle. You can almost see it materially, this morale, because it can crack. The idea that it's something that can crack is very interesting. And the British High Command is trying to figure out how to make German morale crack. And they come out with the usual things. This is actually a long transnational history. There's going to be aerial attacks on the centers of population. They're going to use fire, in other words, incendiary bombs. They're going to combine it with like intermittent sort of nerve-wracking bombing where people don't know when it's going to come. And what do they hope to produce? An internal disruption in Germany. Okay, they're kind of thinking of 1918. We'll come back to that in the First World War. And the interesting last part in red is not only are they going to demoralize the German morale, but by doing so, by attacking German cities and civilians, they're going to raise the morale of our own population. And so we see this over and over again. And what I'm going to argue now is the British were hardly alone in these formulations. The more concept. Oh, you take care of it. Okay, let me back up for a minute. It's just this bar. Okay. But I prefer it not to be there. Thank you. Great. Okay, so let's get back up. The British are hardly alone in this. And the more I looked at all these cases of attacks on other home fronts, I saw the concept of morale, or words like morale, everywhere. In Germany, in Italy, in France, in Russia, in the United States, and across the world, in Japan and China. And then and there, I realized that morale, in many senses, was one of the deadliest discourses of the 20th century. Because in the name of this concept of morale, millions of people were bombed, malnourished, and starved. Okay, so this is the story I'm going to tell today. It's not an American feel-good story, if you're expecting that. Okay, so where do we start the story? You can go way, way back. These things happened before the 20th century. There were sieges, there was that 30 years war, there were all sorts of things where you have strategies for terrorizing or starving enemy non-combatants. So it has a long and an ugly past, but the modern concept of civilian morale, I'm arguing today, dates to the years around the First World War, when I would argue that three major threads, I should say, come together. So first thread is the blockade. Okay. So this is where we see it even before the First World War. British Admiralty's already planning for a blockade of Germany should war break out. And it happens. So the blockade strategies of the British and then the Allies against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then the so-called counter-blockade, the German attempt to isolate Britain and stop food supply to it. In other words, the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign of 1917. So you've got these contrasting blockade strategies. They're both premised on using blockade to stop food in a way that will raise the price of food, that will possibly malnourish, and malnourish whom? Well, they're thinking of the great urban mass of the working class. So that's their target, to limit the food supply so that these workers become hungrier, faced with inflation. They will mount protests against their government, and they will put pressure on their government to surrender. So this was the strategy behind the contesting the competitive blockades. Well, the German unrestricted submarine campaign obviously doesn't work. It's a catastrophic failure. But in 1918, it appears that the British experiment does work, or at least it seemed to work. And this is an important point. The Allied blockade contributed, it was not the only force, but the Allied blockade contributed to widespread food shortages in Germany, Austria-Hungary, but mainly Germany, that would trigger protests from housewives, workers, sailors, mutinies, etc. And it set up a chain of events that resulted in the Kaiser's abdication and a new government that does settle for peace. So people on all sides looked at this event in 1918 and they said, well, it is possible to use an offensive strategy targeting civilians, a blockade, and possibly win a war by it. Now, historians go back and they say it's not that simple, but this isn't my point today. It seemed to be a widely accepted transnational lesson at the time that a food blockade, that demoralization of the working class could result in victory. So that's the first thread in the First World War. The second thread is the concept of civilian morale develops among many of the belligerents on the continent in efforts to monitor war weariness and food shortages by about 1916. So you see the advent in several nations and empires at the time of the so-called morale report. So periodic, often monthly measure of morale, or a word like morale. So you see it in Russia, Tsarist Russia, you see it in Austria-Hungary, you see it in France, but the most advanced of the morale reports were in Germany, and they measured something called Stimmung. Now, Stimmung is an old German term. Many of you know it. It precedes the 20th century. It can mean much more than the modern concept of morale. It means the mood, but it's starting to shade into a 20th century meaning of morale, particularly because you get these morale reports from all the locales in Germany going to army headquarters, and they refer to the general mood, the allgemeine Stimmung. And this is a very important concept, that they actually think there is some sort of collective mood or collective morale. They monitor it. The way they monitor it, when you read, some of you probably read these reports. Anybody read these reports? Okay, they read today in it's very unscientific and very unquantified. They read like weather reports because they'll say the Stimmung this month. It was good, or it was bad, it was calm, or it was turbulent, or it was gloomy. Gedruckt. Okay, so gedruckt appears a lot. But it's interesting that they actually can see that there's something that they can measure, that there's some morale that can exist. And the problem is that once you define a home, that there is a collective mood or morale. It's also something you can bomb, you can starve. So it's a very important part of the story. And it's very transnational. So even the morale reports move around in the First World War. Nations know about each other doing it. And in the Second World War, it becomes pretty much the norm for belligerents to have some sort of measure of morale reports. So those of you who know the British side in the Second World War, you have these very famous morale reports by the Ministry of Information. Some of you have probably read these, but they bear a lot of resemblance to the First World War reports. They also seem like weather reports. Just to give you one example, not the one up there, 19th of September, 1940, Ministry of Information declares people are not so cheerful today. Well, A little more cheerful last week. Maybe next week they'll be more. There's more grumbling today. It really very, very fuzzy. But they think they can do it. And again, it's part of the solidification of this concept of a morale. Now, the third element that we see in the First World War is aerial bombardment. Okay, so the big story. Air power comes in the First World War. We all know this. Military aviation accelerates at a tremendous pace. By 1917, the Germans in particular have developed these big bombers, the Gotha, that's I'll translate. I think it's the Gyre, which is actually has the wingspan of the B-29, the ones that bombed the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's how big these biplanes were, and they bombed London, Paris, and other places, but particularly London and Paris. And the strategy behind them is the Germans are very aware that they can't really hit targets precisely at this point. But they can bomb the center of London, they can bomb the center of Paris, and they're going to do damage, and they're going to freak people out. So we have a lot of notes from what the German strategists, the bombers, think they're doing, and they think they are creating panic in London and Paris. They're terrifying, quote unquote, the morale of the English people, such that the government will sue for peace. So that same strategy we saw with the blockade. Likewise, the British are bombing towns and cities in West Germany. That's as far as they can penetrate. But they too, this is the new RAF that's been created in 1918, and their records show that they're very frustrated about trying to get German munitions factory. They know it's almost impossible to do any destruction to it. So instead, they say we aim at the, quote, wholesale bombing of densely populated industrial centers to, quote, destroy the morale of the operatives themselves. What are they saying? They're saying, we can't hit a factory, but we can kill a lot of workers who work in that factory because they live in densely populated residential areas. So this is a strategy and a tactic you're going to see repeated during this whole story of bombing. It's about an attack on morale more than an attack on material. So the interwar decades, the 1920s and 30s, these ideas coalesced into a coherent concept of morale as the primary object of attack. So you see much more discussion of morale by the 1920s in ways that are quite transnational and connected. In other words, you see very similar formulations when you go from country to country and archive to archive. So especially among the RAF, the British, they've become very infatuated with this idea of bombing morale, moral bombing, they called it. The chief of staff, air chief of staff in the 1920s, Hugh Trenchard, a fairly well-known name, claimed, quote, the psychological effects of bombing outweigh the material damage at a ratio of 20 to 1. How do you derive this morning? Nobody knows. Not even Trenchard. Okay. It's just incredibly fuzzy, and yet these are meaningful statements. They motivate the construction of certain types of aircraft, the types of bombing strategy. So these are important statements. And then this air strategist who was the most influential in the world at the time, somebody like Trenchard, but with a flair for Italian poetry and lyrical expression, was a man named Giulio Due. He wrote in Italian a book called Command of the Air in 1921. It was informally translated by air forces all over the world and also by civil defense operations, extremely persuasive. And Due argued that air power had erased the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. You could fly over the trenches, fly hours into the interior, attack the capital cities. You could use, and then here's where when he talked about death and destruction, he got really there. He said, you could use fire bombs and gas to destroy great centers of population like London and Paris. And then he described in detail how gas would envelop it. You could drop time fuses to stop firefighters from fighting. A very sophisticated idea of what's called strategic bombing would look like. The other thing about Dewey that's very interesting for our story on morale is he saw morale as a product of modernity. So some of you may know in the 1920s in particular, a number of military powers, particularly the British, but also the French, the Spanish, the Italians, started to use their airplanes for something called air control. They used it against what they saw as insurrections in places like Iraq or Somaliland or the northwest frontier of India or Aden or Spanish Morocco. They would use airplanes to try and put down insurrections, and their argument was this was much cheaper than sending ground troops, an argument still here today. So this kind of colonial bombing was the way that air forces sort of kept themselves going in the 1920s when there weren't interstate wars. But Dewey, at the end of the 1920s, after he writes the book, he comments on this colonial bombing, and he's not impressed at all. Because he sees that aerial action is ineffective nearly so against a nomad people living in the desert, but it's highly effective, terrifying, and dreadful against a highly civilized people living in large centers of population. And to sort of parse that out, what he's saying is only the modern city, its interconnections amongst itself, the economy, with politics, etc., is serving as what they call the nerve center of the nation, that attacking the urban centers was the way you defeated the entire nation. So you had to have this sort of large modern cities for morale to make a difference. That if you scared a few people in the desert, it wasn't going to lead to the governments collapsing, to them suing for peace. It was this idea of modernity and interconnection. So this becomes very important. We'll come back to this. And the most disturbing, maybe, of these interwar strategists was a military writer that I think many of you probably heard of, a British writer, very influential at the time, named Basil Liddell Hart. Wrote lots of things that lots of people read. And what he wrote in 1925 is very interesting. So it's called Paris, or the Future of War. And the Paris he referred to, it's basically a play on words. He talked a little bit about the capital of France, but the Paris he really was thinking about was the Paris from the Trojan Wars. Because who was Paris? He was the warrior who killed Achilles by aiming at his Achilles heel. So you see, Little Hart sets out here, and again, this idea of interconnections, the fists and the sinews of war, mutually dependent. If we can demoralize one section of the nation, the collapse of its will to resist compels the surrender of the whole, as happened in 1918. So not by air power, but by blockade in 1918. So this idea that there's this weak link, this Achilles heel, it's the city, it's the workers, it's women and children, it's the soft target. And he's saying, so you don't have to spend all your time on armies and navies. This is what you have to strike. So this is a very important idea. So collectively, these ideas on winning a war by striking morale circulate around the world in the 1920s, early 30s, among air forces, writers, actually science fiction, it's very interesting, political leaders in Europe, Russia, United States, and Japan. And this brings us to Japan, because Japan actually, this is my little argument for trying to bring half of the world into global history, half we ignore, Asia, okay, that actually you do get a better global history when you start including more of the world, in particular a major military player at the time, Japan. So Japan plays a very central role in this process. During the First World War, Japan was not very strongly involved in the fighting. It played a pretty minimal military role, but it had big military budgets, and they used a lot of those budgets to send civilian and military officials to observe, particularly home fronts and battlefronts in Europe, and to come back with lessons for Japan in its next war. And they determined very quickly, particularly the army officers, that the next war would be a total war of the type they were beginning to see in Europe. In fact, the Japanese actually coined the idea of the total war really before Ludendorff's ideas became popular. and came up by 1918 the concept of national total mobilization, which they used all the way to the eve of the Second World War. But among the many things the Japanese observed was that particularly the continental belligerents seemed to be using not only material mobilization of workers and resources, but they also seemed to be mobilizing morale or spirit. So we get into translations, they use for morale, they use the German word Geist, in France, they often use l'esprit. But they're talking about and then they often just say it means morale. So linguistically, all these terms are being fused into this concept of morale. So they're saying, well, one of the things you need to do in this national total mobilization war is you need to mobilize the morale of your people. And they proceed to operationalize this in their war in China that begins in 1937, decades later. And the home front campaign is called the National Spiritual Mobilization Campaign. It's interesting because my colleagues in Japanese history only think about Japan, say, oh, spirit, it's like Buddhism and Shinto, must be religion. But it's really, the origins of this term in this context are really morale. So you could call it the national morale boosting campaign. It would be actually much closer. In other words, Japan is much more slotted into the world and global trends than people acknowledge. So that's important. Now, another thing that's important about Japan is that they are actually firsthand witnesses for a lot of the bombing of London and Paris. They have a lot of civil and military officials in these places as they're being bombed. This is a picture of Paris, Rue de Rivoli. This is around the metro stop, St. Paul, if you've been there. And it sustained the worst attack in London, the worst aerial attack in the First World War in 1918. It's a postcard that the Japanese have taken the postcard and they sell it widely in Japan. What's interesting about their firsthand observations of air raids in Europe is that the Japanese army will then report in a very important military commission, this one below, in 1919. We've observed what happened in London and Paris. We observed panic, and we wonder if enemy aircraft were to firebomb Japan's cities, which are made of wood and paper, they would eviscerate civilian morale. So you see, they're really taking a lot of the messages that they heard in Europe, they're transposing into Japan. They're worried about what will happen, how they prepare for this, and then it actually happens. So in 1923, there is a huge earthquake that hits Tokyo and Yokohama, called the Great Kanto earthquake. It kills upward of 100,000 people, not so much from the earthquake shocks, but from the fires that were set. And interestingly, in this situation, people in Tokyo and Yokohama panic. They form vigilante gangs. They go around, they basically carry out a pogrom against Asian workers, particularly Koreans. They slaughter maybe around 4,000 Korean workers, maybe 300 or 400 Chinese workers. And it's shocking, but it's particularly shocking to Japanese leadership because they realized that, they had this sort of fiction that they very carefully controlled and managed their population, and here people went berserk. What are they going to do? And military leaders at the time in Japan, particularly the vice minister of the army, warned, if this would happen in an earthquake, this is going to be very similar to what happens in an incendiary bombing raid. And it wasn't just the Japanese who noticed this, but our man Little Heart. In other words, it becomes a transnational lesson, a very connected global message. Little Heart writes in this same book in 1925, he writes about the earthquake in Japan, and then he says, an air attack of this intensity is now possible, be likely to exceed even this stroke in its disorganizing and demoralizing effect. And then the next sentence is just priceless because he shifted from Tokyo. saying, imagine for a moment London, Manchester, Birmingham, and half a dozen other great centers simultaneously attacked, the business localities and Fleet Street wrecked, Whitehall a heap of ruins, and then the key sentence. The slum districts maddened into the impulse to break loose and maraud, would not the general will to resist vanish. So it builds on a general fear of working class unrest and unrest from the urban poor. But it's a very transnationally circulated idea. And we'll see that it's not just the people on the offense who imagine what they can do with an air raid. That would be like the Congo earthquake. But on the civil defense side, this is from the Nazi German civil defense magazine, in 1937. And this is shortly after Ludendorff has actually published his book, Total War, Total Krieg, but this is Total Panic. Okay, what will happen? How do we prepare against this aerial onslaught? And they have the San Francisco earthquake, and they have the Tokyo Yokohama earthquake in the center. So it's a very transnational idea of the destruction of the city by enemy bombers, leading to a breakdown in morale. And as a result, in the course of the 1930s, civil defense authorities all over the world, they have actually the same image here that you see in the Japanese pamphlet in 1937 on, let's see, your right side. You have the calm response when people are prepared, when they have civil defense, when they put things back together, they stop people from panicking. And on your left side, they have the unprepared city, which is total chaos. People running around, many more people getting killed. And that image, that's 1936 in Japan. But here's one from Weimar, Germany, at the end of the Weimar Republic. Very similar concept. The undefended city on your left side, totally in rubble and people in despair, and then the one on the right where people are prepared. So civil defense drills become much more regularized after the late 1920s, partly in response to this. Now, the Japanese, how am I doing on time? About 20 minutes? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So the Japanese also become pace setters in the most applied attempt on the offense to break morale. And they do this in their war in China, starting in 1937. Japanese, very quickly, the ground forces, they take Shanghai, they take Nanjing, but then they're kind of stalemated. And air war is one of the ways for the Japanese military command to try and win a war that seems to have bogged down. In other words, can they use air power? So they do this very quickly from the start of the war, even when the ground campaigns are just starting. And it's interesting that when you look at Japanese bombing reports and their instructions, that yes, there are instructions to find Chinese airfields and aircraft factories and things like that. But a lot of the instructions are destroying political targets and targets that will break down the morale of the Chinese people. So I don't have a lot of time to go through this, but when they bomb Nanjing, they actually have to fly hundreds of kilometers. They have some of the world's most longest range bombers at the time. So they fly far into the interior, to the interior capital, Nanjing, but they fly there. The ground forces are nowhere near. They won't be there for months, but they do it because it is a political target. It's where the capital is. It's where the nerve center is. They use these words. It's where they can break down the enemy's morale. And they do similar things in Canton in southern China. And then Chongqing is the nationalist China's rearguard capital. And from 1938 to 1941, they actually fly 700 kilometers a day each way. It's a really long-range bomb, the world's most strategic bombing at the time. Again, they call it political strategic bombing to break the enemy's will to continue the war. So they're playing a big part in this. And you might say, well, it's in Japan, China, who cares, right? They care. We don't care anymore because we're historians and we become very Eurocentric again. But at the time, if you were a bomber in Britain or Germany or France, you cared about the world's first application of strategic bombing and long-range bombing. So the British Committee of Imperial Defense, for about 2 or 3 years, has a series of investigations on air lessons from the bombing in the simultaneous wars, which were simultaneous, the Spanish Civil War and the Second Sino-Japanese War. They conclude that the Spanish Civil War bombing is pretty haphazard. Sometimes the Italians are doing it, sometimes the Germans are doing it. Franco doesn't have any control over it. They see it as pretty small scale. There's only a few bombers involved. But the Japanese effort, they take very seriously. The Japanese can sometimes send 50, 80, or 90 bombers over a target. So this is serious bombing. And they're the RAF is very interested in this experiment. Can the Japanese destroy Chinese morale? Can they use strategic bombing? And in the end, they determined that even though the Japanese are trying to do it, Japan's they're like third, fourth grade Air Force, now British, so they can't quite do it as well. But they also say there's a problem with China. They treat China as one of these cases of like almost global South bombing. They say, well, China's not an organized enough polity for morale to make a difference. So sort of back to Dewey's formulation, morale is for modern interconnected polities, and they're saying China's not that. It's too dispersed, too elementary in structure to respond to morale pressure. In other words, you may free people out, it doesn't matter because they don't have a way of putting pressure on a very despotic regime, the nationalist Chinese. So we have the British basically concluding from all this that it's important to destroy morale. Japanese aren't very good at it. China's not a very good case, but the British are going to do it well in the next war against European populations. And the British chance came soon enough. So World War II would be the conflict when the belligerents believed they finally had the means to win a war by breaking morale on the enemy's home front. So Britain in particular, it's a well-known story, devoted an enormous share of their resources to bombing German cities and firmly committed to the tactic of area bombing and morale bombing or moral bombing. So in other words, what is area bombing? Well, the British conclude early on in the war, they can't actually hit any target with any precision. I mean, they can't even get close. So it's more effective to bomb the center of a densely populated German city or town. So that's what area bombing is. It sounds fairly nice. It's not nice at all. It's dropping your bombs on densely populated working class neighborhoods because it's only the working class neighborhoods that have that level of density. So they do that. We know the spectacular results, but of course there are many more German cities and towns. Now, what's interesting about the British bombing of Germany, but we could say this about all these cases, is how does a strategist theorize what the results, what the outcome of bombing cities and bombing morale will be? And this is something, I'm thinking like President Trump right now says he's going to bomb Iran, but then you say, well, what's that supposed to do? In other words, what is the chain of events that President Trump or people with maybe more intelligence think might happen? And so this is a problem that goes right back to the advent of this sort of bombing. What do you think is going to happen when you spend all these resources and all this death and destruction? How's it supposed to end the war? And so I just put up a few of the things that I've noticed in my research on what they think the probable results are. Well, one is kind of obvious. You're going to kill a lot of people, densely populated areas. Not only kill the workers, but kill their families. It's going to traumatize workers. We'll get to that. Indirectly, you're going to decrease industrial production by death or absenteeism. So this is something that's more measurable, correlational, but measurable. That, again, you can't hit a factory very well, but you can kill a lot of workers and you can slow down production that way. So that's one possibility. A third is almost a physiological one. It's to render people just dysfunctional, to terrorize them, to paralyze them with fear. And we know this happens. I mean, people just sort of break down who have been the victims of bombing. So that's another one. The fourth one is the one that the British introduced, but the Americans also enthusiastically embraced in Germany and in Japan, dehousing. Okay? Dehousing, okay? So in other words, whether you kill the worker or not, destroying their housing is going to, really put a wrench in the machine of total war. Another outcome is mass evacuations. Again, whether you get people, whether you kill them or not, if you can terrorize them into leaving the cities and leaving the factories, and you can cause chaos in transportation, this can really impede the war effort. And then the final one, the one that historians sometimes just pay too much attention to. Richard Over just did this in his book on bombing in Japan. This idea, this kind of fantasy that bombing will lead workers to insurrection, revolution, or other popular pressure on the government to surrender. In other words, the so-called lesson of 1918, which never really happens in the Second World War. But this is the one I say that historians often focus on it when they say morale, you can't really break morale. It's because they say, well, morale wasn't broken in the Second World War because there was no 1918 moment. German workers did not protest against Hitler and they did not stop the war. But you have to think of the other five. A lot of those things do happen and they do affect the war, but how they affect it is, again, very fuzzy. So all of this, we can say on the European side that Allied bombing, despite being very large scale, ultimately fails to break German morale. And we know this because land invasions were necessary to defeat Germany. Air power was not sufficient. But these failures of air power have led many historians, including Richard Overy, to conclude that bombing simply stiffens morale. Doesn't break morale, it stiffens morale, and you hear this generalization all the time. I mean, this is the myth of the Blitz in Britain, that it just, made the Germans, the British stand up. London can take it, all this sort of thing. The language of resilience and defiance. Okay, so that is the European story, the German story. But again, we got to go global. It's not the only war that's going on. And the end of the war in Japan challenges this generalization, I will argue, this generalization about morale. And I am arguing that the United States air attack on morale in Japan was actually ruthlessly effective, even without the atomic bombs. Okay, so 64 Japanese cities were destroyed by firebombs, and only 2 cities at the end by atomic bombs. So, okay, I better repeat what I just said because it's a total heresy. I argue the U.S. attack on morale was ruthlessly effective. Okay, it's a heresy. Could be burned at the stake. I'm hoping there's an exemption for ERC principal investigators. But we'll see what happens. Okay, but anyway, what's my argument? So the argument is that, okay, so the U.S. campaign against civilians in Japan, forget about the atomic bombs for a few minutes, consisted of 2 things in particular: a food blockade and aerial bombardment. Okay, so food blockade against Japan. What is that? Well, again, like nobody knows because it's disappeared from history. But basically, in the last 5 months of the war, 1945, the U.S. command deployed some of their big B-29s that were dropping fighter bombs, but to drop aerial mines like this in the straits, particularly Straits of Shimonoseki. It's between the north of the island Honshu and Kyushu, major choke point, to drop aerial mines and to stiffen a blockade that was already occurring, but stopping food from coming from northeastern Asia, so Manchuria in particular. This was keeping the Japanese alive. This was like 20% of their food supply. They were getting very hungry at this point. So the U.S. operation, this aerial mining operation, was called at the time Operation Starvation. Okay, and okay, those of you who are more literary say, well, it's a metaphor. They don't really mean starvation, but they do. Okay, and if you look at the report, the mission report after the starvation campaign was over, they talk about starving the industry of materials and eventually cease production. But the enemy population will be reduced to starvation. Combined with incendiary raids will reduce the civilian will to wage war. Therefore, it's called starvation. And then they talk about basically shutting down 20 to 30% of Japanese caloric consumption, and they've reached at least 20%. Difference between subsistence and starvation. Blockade was complete. Japan was doomed to starvation. And it's actually true. Japan's food situation was in really bad shape by early August 1945, before the two atomic bombs. People really were beginning to die of food starvation-related conditions. Okay, so that's the blockade. The firebombing also is very concentrated in the last 5 months of the war in 1945. Massive destruction of Tokyo and 4 of the big cities, 5 of the big cities, like 4 of the big cities. But this aerial campaign continues, and it continues not only against the big cities like Tokyo and Osaka, but against the smaller cities. But here we pause for a minute because the literature from American military historians is that the U.S. Army Air Force, unlike the nasty British, the RAF, never targeted morale. They're much more scientific. They use precision bombing. They did industrial targets. Well, it's just not true, particularly in the Japanese case. They did bomb industrial targets, but they had this other category that historians get confused by, attacking urban industrial areas. And I show you a target information sheet. This was one for the massive bombing of Tokyo in March 1945 that killed 100,000 people. Okay, what's the category? Urban industrial area. So without knowing anything, you assume that's where the factories are. No, it's where the workers live. It's the densely populated residential areas. The factories are on the outside of the city, and the urban industrial areas is British-style area bombing of densely populated urban areas. How do we know this? Because let's look at the rest of this target information sheet in the raid on Tokyo. They go on to explain the area they're attacking has 103,000 people per square mile, and they're attacking 10 square miles. Okay. If anybody's a demographer, you will know that is a very crowded place when they say it. Probably the most densely populated area in any modern industrial city in the world. They're undoubtedly correct. And in the lead up to the bombing, the U.S. Committee of Operations Analysts, the strategists, predict very openly in bombing the 6 major cities, 500,000 killed, almost 8 million dehoused, 3.5 million evacuees, 560,000 casualties, 290,000 are projected to be workers. And you say, well, who are the rest of them? Oh, they're their children, their wives. So that's what they're doing. They're attacking places that are so densely populated they couldn't have a major factory in them. They are just people. They are the built-up areas. So what's supposed to happen in all this? Well, when the U.S. We're almost there, right? Okay, wrapping it up. Okay, so when the U.S. moves in the summer of 1945 to attacking 58 small and medium cities, they use a definite psychological warfare. These are not very industrial cities, and they're basically just trying to spook people. And how do we know that? Well, they would drop hundreds of thousands of leaflets like this on a city saying, "You're next." Okay. They played a form of what you could call American roulette. So this is from the New York Times, the handbill up here. It shows B-29s dropping bombs, and in these circles are 11, or in some cases 14 cities. And they're saying, what are they saying? Well, here's what the opposite of the handbill says. It says, in the next few days, the U.S. Air Force is going to attack 4 more of these cities, but we're not going to tell you which ones. See the revolver moving here. So what do they want to do? Well, they talk about American well-known humanitarian policies, which might escape the Japanese at the time. But what they want them to do is they want people to get out. They want them to run away. They want them to evacuate. And then at the end, they have this fantasy. You can also overthrow your leaders. And that doesn't count. But do they run away? Oh, yeah. Okay. And the fleeing is a very important story in the defeat of Japan. Unknown, but 8.5 million Japanese leave the 5 big cities after they're bombed in the spring, and hundreds of thousands more leave the small cities. And I won't take your time on, but we have police reports from political police talking about what this looks like. It's totally chaotic. People are paralyzed with fear. They're desperate. They're even becoming anti-military and defiant against the upper classes. So all this stuff is actually happening. And in the end, I would argue the breakdown in morale was crucial, but not in the way predicted by some of the strategists. Not because people revolted or forced governments to surrender, but because Japanese leaders recognized that morale had collapsed, that the morale of their people had collapsed. The basis of total war had shut down. People weren't in the factories, they weren't in the cities, they were despondent, they were malnourished from Operation Starvation, and in the end, leaders realized that people were in no shape to resist any sort of American invasion. And this is one of the chief reasons I would argue that the Japanese surrendered. It's not just atomic bombs, not just the Soviets entering the war, but it's that the home front itself had basically collapsed as an instrument of total war. So finally, post-war story, and then I'll end. Okay, what does all this mean for the war that will come after 1945, the Cold War? Well, the Japanese defeat converted the U.S. Air Force, which is newly formed after the war as an independent force. It converts the U.S. Air Force and a group of people called social psychologists. It converted these two groups into big cheerleaders for using bombing, even nuclear bombing, to destroy morale. So does anybody know the name Rensis Lickert? Yeah, exactly. Okay. Lickert becomes very famous in the post-war period. He directs the Survey Research Center. He's kind of like the father of American public opinion research and other things like the Lickert scale. He was the head of the morale division of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey that is supposed to assess the effects of the bombing in Germany, and then, this is 1944 and early 1945, then build on those lessons for how the U.S. should bomb Japan. He was the biggest backer of destroying morale as a way of making it worse. I mean, it's part of his bread and butter. Social psychology defines what morale is, and so it's clearly a way of elevating one's body of knowledge. We can see that. Anyway, just to bring all this to close, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the final report of the U.S. Strategic Bombing and Morale Division was that World War II against Japan was, among other things, an attack on Japanese morale. It was an attack on the nation as a whole, aimed at them, aimed at their houses, aimed at them because they were workers, tried to cause fright, and then finally at the end, they might even become potential saboteurs and revolutionaries. And this is a wacky statement because this never happened. But the last sentence for any red-blooded patriotic American might give a little pause. The American attack against the civilian population of Japan was successful. I mean, chew on that for a minute. That's horrifying. But anyway, what does all this mean? Well, we end with one last slide. In 1946, the Provost General of the United States, talking about civil defense, said, morale is not nebulous. It is not intangible. It can be seen, it can be heard, and it can be destroyed. And on that, the moralizing note, I
Fantastic, thanks so much. It makes you realize listening to it's kind of Dewey's century as a kind of prophet of what's to come and what shadows into the 21st century. Of course, we have a lot of students here in the back, which is very good. So it'd be kind of nice if we can hear from some of them, and then we'll just take questions. We've got about 40 minutes, if that's okay. You've got a question about this. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Johan. I'm a default student in history here in Oxford. My question is about, well, I have multiple questions because it's so fascinating, but I leave it with two. first question is on the links between total war and the morale, because as it's argued in a sort of scholarship on warfare, the total war came as a result of rationalizing war in the end of 19th, early 20th century. And clearly what you identify there is kind of fits into this category, even if the concept technically was not there before 1919 and Ludendorff. So how do you see the correlation between the two or so? So that would be first one. Second, you mentioned that your project considers the Soviet Union, yet in your presentation you almost kind of omitted it. So how does that story fits into your broader narrative, given the fact that we start with revolutionary warfare advocated by Lenin, and so kind of picked up by Stalin towards the Second World War, and then we can see this resemblance. So how does that kind of different attitude toward warfare fit into the story of Mark?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'll try and give you some pretty quick answers. Total war, it is intimately involved with the evolving concept of total war. So even if you don't have total war as a much used word until, let's say, 1935 Ludendorff, people have been talking about it in various ways. John Horn, the historian, talks about a totalizing effect, even of the First World War. Japanese are using the words total, as I said, as early as 1918. But the idea of total war, and you all know this because your question was very good. Total war means various things. It means, on one hand, you're mobilizing the total resources of your nation, but it also means on the offense that there's no inhibitions against attacking civilians and others on the other side. So in that sense, the totalizing idea is, well, there's no such thing as a non-combatant anymore. They're a worker in the factory. They're a woman mobilizing savings bonds in their local community. They're all part of the war effort. They're all legitimate targets. So that's the total war. Soviet Union. So the honest answer to that is we haven't hired the Soviet Union postdoc. That happens at the end of this year. We couldn't hire everybody at once. It's a black box to me. I don't know a lot about it. But we're dealing with a lot of things. So the Soviet case, a lot of it's going to be about food and the Nazi hunger plan. We don't know if the aerial bombardment is as important in the Soviet case, but the hunger and food is very important. Mobilization of the home front. Are the Soviets doing it in a totally unique way, common to communism, or are they actually learning from others? And then we think there's a lot of transnational connections, despite some of the exceptional nature of the Soviet home front. But I can't tell you yet because we don't know. That's part of the project. Yes.
We got 6 people off screen. Well, let's go another student. Yeah, please, Oscar, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Jump on. I'm a master's student here in the history department. My question is if morale is a category that carries over past the end of the war.
A little louder, please.
I'm wondering if morale is a term of analysis that carries over after the end of the war, and if takes on a sort of technocratic quality, thinking of the consumer price index becoming a metric that's used after the end of World War II in England as a way to generally measure how much people can spend.
So I don't know the answer to it on the domestic side. On the offensive side, for the U.S. in particular, since they're the bombing nation after the war, nobody else really can do that except the Soviets. They use that term morale all the time, and even in the late 50s now, things have been declassified, and there are all these urban area targets for nuclear attacks on the Soviet Union, and they have the same principle. They use the word morale. It's the field day for social psychologists is the late 40s and 50s. And if you think of the Vietnam War, what is Hearts and Minds about? It's again winning the morale of the people who back you in Vietnam, and then obviously demoralizing the enemy. So on the offensive, I just don't know enough about Britain. If they're still doing morale reports. I think so, but maybe you're right. Maybe it morphs into that. Sorry.
Yeah, it was a big pleasure hearing this, especially after having heard your previous talk at Oxford, unless I've missed another one in between, on the Japanese case.
Uh-huh.
And that which stayed with me. And I really appreciate the way you're sewing these stories together. However, I have questions about the extent to which morale serves as a key to understanding the civilianization of violence in Europe during the era of the two world wars. And that's particularly because the areas of Europe that experience, exponentially the highest rates of civilian mortality are not the civilized parts of Europe, right? They're the areas where basically forms of colonial warfare is being implemented, right? And so it seems like a very West European oriented narrative. So I'm wondering where this fits with like the continuity hypothesis that the exponential violence that we see in Europe during the two world wars is actually the application of methods of colonial warfare against inferior rural and racially inferior populations in Eastern Europe for the most part.
Yeah, no, the excellent question. So I should have clarified at the start that when we chose our three areas of analysis, we were not ruling out all other forms of violence against civilians. Okay, sexual violence, genocide, as you say, colonial violence. All of the colonial violence I'm really pursuing in my own work. In fact, that's just in Q this week, looking at colonial bombing and trying to understand violence in the empire. So we're not saying that these three forms of violence created all the violence. Colonial violence is very important. Violence in Eastern Europe is very important. The reason we framed it this way is partly just the honest admission that we can't do everything, but that we're trying to come up with areas that all of our belligerents are practicing, both at home and offensively. And so in that sense, we're going to let other people do it. There's been a lot of work on violence in Eastern Europe. There's been a lot of work on genocide. I'm not going to rewrite the book on genocide. Now, where we shade into it is the Soviet case, which, as I said, we haven't gotten to yet. But we're well aware that we're not just talking about the subtle type of total war that the Americans or the British or that even the Japanese would practice. We are talking about genocide, which is not identical with total war, because total war is supposed to stop when the war stops, and genocide does not. So when we get into things like the Nazi hunger plan, we're getting into things that are both trying to persuade the Soviet Union to surrender, but also are just trying to eliminate the categories of people. So we're going to do it that way. I'm making a very good effort to try and learn more about colonial violence. I don't like the kind of cliches I see right now that colonial violence just boomerangs and comes back to Europe and allows people to kill people in a way that they would never have killed before. Well, that's not the bombing blockade story. I mean, this stuff's been going on a long time. So we're trying to look at the interactions with the other violence, but we're not studying everyone centrally. Sorry, that's all we can do in a global study with 10 cases in East Asia and everything. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was struck when you made the parallels between destroying morale in one place being necessarily connected with raising morale in the other.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether the two can actually switch places, and I'll tell you why I suggest this, which is in 1919, as you know, very famously, the British, so immediately after the war, are deploying aerial bombing in India, but also other forms of violence, most famously and famously the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919.
Mm-hmm.
And the commission of inquiry that's set up afterwards is fascinating because both the massacre, General Dyer, and of course the aerial bombing in Punjab and the frontier, the reasoning of the British military officials has to do with having a good moral effect on the people being bombed, and educating them. So in a way, their recalcitrance is seen as being the problem, which violence would solve.
Yeah.
So, here it's violence that has a moral effect.
Yeah.
And they might even use terms like improving morale.
Yeah.
And of course, you see this in the Second World War as well with the Bengal famine, where you have some 3 million killed.
Yeah.
On, as it were, the Imperial home front. Because food has to be taken, not brought to India, and taken to newly liberated countries like Greece, newly liberated from the
right.
Nazis.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, you're maintaining morale in India by starving them. So I just find this kind of switching of places very interesting. And yet at the same time, you have the opposite.
Yeah.
So if you think about the post-colonial situation, India-Pakistan wars, for instance, have never taken on this model. They've all been wars fought outside civilian areas, following more or less scrupulously the laws of war. Now, of course, because they're both nuclear armed countries, they have to operate through terrorism, which does attack civilian areas, though it's not the area of bombardment.
No.
Because when that happens, it's still in non-civilian areas. So I find it fascinating, the layering of these. You have a apparently quite old-fashioned understanding of war, even with the use of aircraft on the one hand, post-colonial, and on the other hand, a kind of transfer of functions as far as morale is concerned.
Yeah. Two really interesting points. So in fact, as I said, I'm here this week looking at the bombing northwest frontier, Iraq, Somaliland, and I'm seeing all the things you're talking about: moral effect, punishment, the idea of what you have to do as a village to qualify for being bombed, and you kind of just have to be uppity and recalcitrant. And these terms are, I was horrified to read these terms. So what I can say is, what I'm trying to sort out in my project is these various types of moral bombing or morale bombing. They're not identical. So when you're bombing Japan or if you're bombing Germany, you're trying to have an effect on their state to surrender. When you're bombing in colonial territorial situations, you're trying to punish them for being resistant and getting them to be compliant and pay taxes, things like that. There are differences, even though the word is the same, moral effect. So that's why I say you always have to ask the question: what is the morale bombing for? What is the expected outcome? And I have to say, reading these British documents this week, I don't know what they're doing. I don't think they know what they're doing. It doesn't make sense to me. As you say, why do you want to bomb people to make them good British subjects? It's really weird. So that's not an answer, but it shows I'm trying to resolve this, but it seems very different than this internation bombing between roughly equivalent states. But it's connected.
That's 7 people. So maybe we'll start coupling a few. So
all right.
Yeah, just being quickly on, I echo the others. I think the colonial dimension of it's relevant. You mentioned it for Japan. Manchuria is a colony of Japan. It's ruled as a colonial territory. So this colonial part of the story, I think it's something that it's missing as well. Also because you made a good case. You mentioned an Italian that has in mind some sort of empire when looking at air bombing. And it's really interesting, this civilizational difference that it's still there. And I'm really wondering on this, how does it fit with then fascist Italy bombing Ethiopia? And although I agree with you on the fact that the aim is really different, probably, because it's not to make the Ethiopian emperor to surrender. It's territory, right?
Sure.
So it's different. But I think there's something more probably on that part. That's what I'm.
Well, that's an issue. That's a sovereign state. They are trying to make the Ethiopian emperor surrender.
Wait a
Okay,
second.
then.
Okay, did you?
Then you're not, sorry, second one, really fascinating this. I'm really wondering, I see how you're tracking into this global history of global war. I'm really wondering what are the connections, and especially how allies work in this, because is there an exchange of these kind of information and these kind of practices, and whether this exchange is not only on the offensive side but also on the defensive side, like beyond the drills. how do we deal with also our population freaking out because of being bombed?
Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. I do appreciate the scope of your talk, your presentation of 1914 to 1945. However, what I'd like to ask you is that since the end of the Second World War, the United States and broadly Western Europeans have actually developed another mechanism for morale boosting, and that's sanctions. And in the mid-2025, 35 countries were sanctioned simultaneously by the United States. That at the same time, do you agree that the modern morale boosting mechanism is the imposition of sanctions of various countries?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the Japanese, the problem with the way I think we're doing some post-colonial history, we're assuming all empires are exactly the same and they exert the same. So the Manchuria, there is very minimal bombing of civilians in Manchuria. First of all, the Japanese takeover is very fast. It's 1931, 32. It doesn't last very long. There is an episode or two. They're not necessarily, they're not cities, they're not necessarily bombing civilians. But a lot of people go back in my own field and they say, well, because it's happening in Ethiopia, because it's happening in Afghanistan or Iraq, that it must be happening the same way. And it's not. Okay. So that's one thing. I found very little evidence of Japanese doing colonial bombing. When they bombed China, even though everybody wants to say, well, they're a non-white people, of course, Japanese are too, but it is an interstate war. It's a real war. So you can't use exactly the same categories. Okay, so that's one thing. So we got to be careful there. We have to scrutinize each case. Now, yes, a very quick answer. Tons of exchange of information on defense of home fronts, from rationing to civil defense. I've got lots of evidence from archives that show how they're doing this back and forth. Okay, sanctions are an interesting thing. There is this book by Nicholas Mulder on sanctions in the 1930s. Sanctions are often conflated with blockade. They look similar, but they're somewhat different in that a blockade is an actual act of war. And the blockades I'm talking about are, the British can blockade Germany. They've got two routes, the English Channel and the North Sea. Yeah, okay. Operation Starvation, they totally surround the island. You stopped everything. Sanctions are much more porous. But you are right that the strategy, maybe the fuzzy strategy again, is somehow it's going to set in motion events that will lead to your desired results. So we got Iran, and what's supposed to happen? Well, there's no doubt that people's nutrition has been very much affected by sanctions. Maybe that's a result of protests now. Is it going to work? It's hard to say, but it's not this. It's just not as thorough as a blockade. A blockade can really stop everything. So we just have to differentiate.
Yeah, so Peter and Michael next to.
Like everybody else, I think I was absolutely enthralled by what you had to say. But the obvious reflection I suggest is that what you're doing, of course, is you're mining a particular scene. The question is how the scene fits in with everything else. And my other general thought is that for all the transnational connections, the question is nonetheless is whether they're going to be absorbed in the same way in the different states. But let's just take some very old examples, which I think are very well known. So, for example, the British case is obviously a very interesting case. And I was surprised, in fact, you didn't cite one of the best evidences of how, in fact, the governing class have been seduced by all this talk of morale, which is the evacuation of children at the beginning of the Second World War. And that's a very interesting episode, which of course, in fact, backfires. Turns out this is not very popular, particularly with the people being evacuated. That's just an instance. I suppose all sorts of reflections come to my mind. I'm sure they do for everybody else. Sorry. But you have to, again, in the British case, there's good evidence that, again, they believe this because they build strategic bombers. But if you want to make your case, you have to say, why don't the Germans create a strategic bombing force in the Second World War? Equally, following Phillips, Pace and O'Brien, why is it that, in fact, the Soviets simply don't invest in aircraft to anything like the extent that any other power does? And it goes on. So you quote the Morale Division report of the Strategic Bombing Survey, but not all the other divisions of the report, which of course are saying entirely different things. So I suppose what I want to get at is that it's a great project. Obviously, you should definitely do it. But I think at the end of the day, you need to think a bit about how it's going to link in to all the data that's been established elsewhere.
Yes, again, thanks for a really fascinating talk, and the project sounds amazing. I want to pick up on Peter's first point, which how it fits into bigger questions or bigger context. And I thought about the way in which you thought about morale as seen as a feature of modernity, which resonated with me. And I was wondering about the advent of psychiatry, sociology, notions of collective consciousness that are emerging at the 19th century. So whether those things feature in your account. And the other thing that struck me in your paper is the way in which we're dealing with infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, all of these elements. So there's a really interesting literature out of Saint-Simon in the early 19th century about infrastructure enlivening populations, testing their morale, etc. And you're doing something which is the reverse of that. You destroy the infrastructure and the morale declines. And there was that rang a really interesting outlook.
Take us to, okay, running out of time. Big questions. Okay, so evacuation of children. So that's a perfect example of how transnational learning can get changed on the ground. So you're right about the evacuation of British children, but it's very much noticed internationally. And the Japanese notice it, but they also learned that the British did things wrong, okay, that they took these working class children and they put them in middle class households that didn't like them at all. And what the Japanese did was in 1943-44, lots of studies of British evacuation, said we're going to move children with their school classes and with their teachers and set them up in like resorts and that in the safe areas of Japan and try and solve the problem that the British had. So things connect, but they don't mean that they're the same. They don't necessarily homogenize. So we're always looking at connection and comparison, not just connection. Okay. Okay. Why did the Germans not do long-range bombers? Well, you know, just have to ask them. But we know that in both the German and the Soviet cases that they focus a lot on the other. They focus on tactical bombing, as you know, in the German case. So they build really good tactical bombers. And tactical bombers, if you're running an army campaign on the continent, can be very, very useful. They think about 4-engine long-range bombers, but they don't do it. Why, in the end, they don't do it? I mean, it looks a little contingent, but basically, the army has, you know, the British RAF just has a lot of resources. They have in the 20s and 30s won a lot of big jurisdictional battles, and the Luftwaffe does not in the same way. So I think that's the case. And the Soviets probably, again, they've got so many people, and they don't have much money. So they can't invest that much in aircraft. So I hope that's okay. But I'm not oblivious to strategy. I read stuff too. And these are questions, and we know the British can do it, and the Germans can't do it. We also know that Hitler chooses not to do it. He takes the bombers away from England, sends them to the Balkans, and sends them to the Soviet Union. It's a decision. Okay. Now, Michael, it was so the history of knowledge is extremely important to this story. So social psychology is I kind of focused on that, but psychiatry, the study of nervousness, like all of these are from the 19th century. Why do we get words like nerve center? They talk about capital cities in very physiological ways that you sever the nerves, you sever the muscular connections. So a lot of this language is there. Now, what is interesting is I chose not to start with the history of knowledge. So I could do a study of social psychologists and look at their origins, but what's interesting is they're important in some places and not others. So they're very important in the United States by World War II. They never have that stature, I would argue, in Britain. They're not included in Arthur Harris's bomber campaign. I couldn't find them there. It's like, gentlemen scholars from Oxbridge who are in the civil service and in the military, they come out with all these kind of so-called scientific ideas of morale and busting morale. They are not trained psychologists, psychiatrists. So they're building on what they hear in the media and who they meet, but it's not as direct. The American case is the most direct, I found. It's an interesting. But destroying infrastructure, yeah. Of course, you're creating new infrastructures also to sustain total war. But yeah, so the destroying the infrastructures they constantly use the word to disrupt more.
Okay, I'm aware that we're going to probably go next time a little bit, but we've got 6 people left on the list. If people can keep their questions brief,
Okay.
I think we can get them answered. So it's the next round. We'll do it 3 in a row. Nick, Ada, and Indeed.
Wonderful talk. I also want to stick with cultures and knowledge, I guess. So one of the really striking things about the way this is all framed is that from beginning to end, from Douay to your final American report, gold standard is breakdown and revolution, and everything else is sort of low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about it are 2 things. One is they have a very primitive idea of how social breakdown happens, which looks more like Gustave Le Bon, the crowd theory and hysteria from the late 19th century, or your marauding gangs from the East End. And there's no sense of social organization. And so if you think about these ideas evolving in parallel with Marxist ideas of revolution, they're more or less contemporaneous, except they're buying into a stab in the back myth that revolution happens and therefore the front collapses in Germany, whereas all the revolutionaries think that the front collapses and therefore revolution happens, and that actually military defeat has to happen first, which is probably tells you a lot about the Soviet-German war. Although the Nazis are great protagonists of the stab in the back, they usually don't believe what they believe in, whereas the British and Americans do seem to believe in it.
Yeah.
And all of the theory, all of the interpretations of how workers actually organize themselves have also already been theorized at this time. Whereas Luxembourg on the mass strike. What's his name? Famous account of the German Revolution of 1918, which comes out in the early 1920s and is then copied, Rosenberg, which is then copied by everybody else since. Right. They're all there. It's not that the knowledge isn't available. It's like it's quarantined. This is an elite, as you say, amateurish theorizing, which may have a bit of the sciences in the American variant, but actually has nothing to do with the people who are equally trying to foment revolution and failing to do so.
Right.
Okay, let's comment on that.
I want to think about the sort of imperial home front in a very different way to how we've sort of talked about it so far. So I'm researching the Indian region and the Arab region, so looking at how essentially the German army coaches members of allied prisoners of war and create their own sort of liberation armies in a way. And in the opposite, there is a very sort of explicit use of like morale and this idea that if British subjects themselves can't stay loyal to Britain or France. How they expect to sort of last through a war, how is the empire supposed to last out the Second World War? So I'm just interested in that sort of, if you're telling a global story of, the home front, how is, yes, these sort of foreign legions that essentially do end up fighting from Germany. So that this whole idea of the spectacle of seeing an Indian guy in German uniform, that's being a really good thing. But
David Madden, European Studies Centre. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. In your extensive readings, have you come across anyone who tried to argue the distinction between belligerence and non-belligerence, or had that effectively been thrown out the window by the concept of total warfare?
Just to clarify, you mean combatants and non-combatants?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Those three.
Okay. Okay. So back to the next. That's a really cool question. And indeed, the language that's used, and I mean, I can even show you the Japanese accounts of why Germany collapsed in 1918, because they wrote extensively. It is a 19th century. They're using 19th century words. You saw Little Heart appear. The slum areas of Madden. It's not the language of scientific Marxism, right? They're talking about in the 1905 that if there's a French blockade of Britain, the masses from the East End will go to the houses of the rich. They'd say, if we're going to starve, you're going to starve. So it's the language of food riots and things like that. And I don't know that they ever overcome that. Certainly not the social psychology of the American ones. They don't use a Marxist language at all.
But it's not even sociological. That's what's interesting.
No, it's not. Sorry. Okay, enough for you. We'll talk again. Okay. But Adam, oh, sorry.
Yes.
Excuse me. Well, I mean, I think what you're bringing up is the term morale. Globally circulates. It's being used in these new ways. It's being used in all sorts of ways. Loyalty to the metropole, to the empire, to the nation. So the categories are being created and they're being used. And okay, so we do need to think global. So this is very important, your case. But East Asia is also really important, and it has been totally ignored because the Europeans never colonized it. And so what happens is a lot of European history then it has the imperial extension, which is really good, but we miss out on all these other cases that have, like 1.5 billion people. They're very important. Japan, the principal nations in the war. So when I say global, I'm cognizant of the fact I'm not covering every country in the world, but I'm covering these really big cases that have been totally ignored. But again, everything's globally circulating, so it's quite clear why it should appear in your work as well. David. Okay. So non-combatant, combatant. So this is the big debate of 1920s and 1930s international law. The total war advocates, people like Dewey, they're very explicit. They say there's no such thing, no distinction anymore between combatant and non-combatant. Not everybody agrees with that. So the Japanese bombed Chinese cities in 1937 and 38, and they're confronted with people saying you're violating the Hague rules, you're attacking non-combatants. The Japanese say no, these are military targets. There are areas around railroad tracks, but so it's a tension. It doesn't the status of non-combatant doesn't go away, but it's everybody operationalizes in a way that seems to serve their purposes. But it is interesting that with aerial warfare and blockade, how can you have a distinction anymore if you're bombing neighborhoods that women and children live in? In effect, you're much stronger the distinction.
Last three, if I can just be quick. So it's Mark, and then you, and then that. Yeah. Okay.
My questions. Why would you say was the air war against
Japanese successful and in Germany not? And does the USPS say so? And what would be the difference? And the second question would be, would you say that the USSBS is a quantification of moral? You said at first that there was no quantification and scientification. Does that change with the USSBS?
All my really good questions have already been asked by other people. So I'm going to ask, I think, any good questions. Why 1905 to start picking up?
Hi, yeah, I'm Joseph. I'm a master's student in the department. Yeah, so building on the question about modernity and sort of a broader history around this concept, I wanted to ask about the distinction between morale and public opinion, because there seems to be a history of sort of military history of the rise of this concept, of the transnational rise of it, in military or strategic circles. But at the same time, you have increasing number of politicians and intellectuals who are talking about public opinion or international public opinion and morality as ways of regulating the international system after these wars. So do you see a correlation in the way that the role of the general population in the affairs of the states and in international affairs changes across this period? And is there part of a broader story about modern states and the role of the population and its mass participation in way in its affairs and international affairs?
Can I just use my role and just ask a quick question? I mean, you're making a very strong case for the interconnection of a kind of transnational war, but it's remembered mostly nationally, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do with the fact that you're trying to write a different kind of history of the Second World War, but in a sense the kind of mnemonic containers, the narratives are still very nationally driven.
Yeah. Anyway. I start with yours.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, that was really good stated, and I did write an essay on this. Because all the memories of like resilience and standing up and taking it, you think of the myth of the blip, they're all nation centered, but the very language of resilience is actually transnationally moving around. So just a quick example, Winston Churchill in 1940 gives his famous Final Hour speech. Part of it he says, well, the Germans are about to bomb us. We must stand up to this like the brave men of Barcelona. And so, and then the Chinese have their narrative in 1937. All these things are moving around. So even the narratives that look so national to us are in many senses transnational. But so if the answer to your question, what am I doing about the fact that the memories are national? Well, I'm having fun because I can bust them and show that there's a lot more connected than you think. Okay, so let's see. Mark. Quantification, yes. It's not until the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey that you get a lot of public opinion surveys. The British are doing a little bit in the home front, but it's not much. But the Americans go crazy. This is the era I grew up when I went to university. We're studying all these things that Licker was doing, all these public opinion surveys. It's the reason I didn't become a political scientist. I didn't tell you. But this stuff really dominated. It's very American, and it starts during this period. And Mark knows this because he knows his history well. But when the investigators from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, they go to the parts that the Allies have just liberated in Western Germany, and then they go to Japan after the war. And they give all these people these surveys like, did the bombing make you want to give up? And then, somebody's supposed to tell the victorious interrogator a truthful answer. I mean, they're fun to read. They're fun to give to students because they have a certain absurdity to them as a document. But that's when you start to see that. And your second question was
Germany compared to
yeah.
Japan.
Okay. So yeah. So we get back to Peter, I think. So the strategic bombing survey, they say a lot of things depending on which division is talking about. But in some, if you look at most of the Japanese reports, not just morale, but the other ones, they make a case that I think is pretty good, that they really have destroyed the Japanese economy and infrastructure. They've destroyed the cities. 2/3 of Tokyo empties out. You can't run a total war when you lose that sort of population. So their statistics are pretty good. Their blockade statistics, they're done hurriedly, but they're not bad. So they do make a distinction. Then there's the big question I probably can't answer, but why is this? Why is it different? Okay, here's the heretical part. The Japanese are actually a more normal nation than Nazi Germany. That at a certain point they get hammered and they say, we give up. They give up before they're invaded. Now, you might think it's just atomic bombs, but it's not just atomic bombs. They know at a certain point, way too late. Would have been nice if they figured out a year earlier, but they know too late. They know at a certain point they've got to give up. That their country's going to be annihilated. I've got all sorts of documents that show the reasoning. And I mean, Hitler's nuts. I mean, they don't give up. So
The last two
Yeah.
students. Yeah, they asked
Oh, I'm
questions.
sorry. 1905. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Because at this time of day, I need a low-hanging fruit question. Okay. 1905. Okay. So I'm at Oxford, so I'm trying to be clever. Okay. And I'm trying to do something that nobody thinks about. Why 1905? Two reasons that I can come up with, and I'm sure I'll find more as I go. You can always start anytime you want, right? But 1905. First of all, the Russo-Japanese War, which nobody cares about because we're in Europe. But it's actually a global event. And there's lots of observations by the Western powers about why the Japanese win this war against a so-called Western like power. And especially the British, but the French, the Germans, and others, they come up with, well, the Japanese succeeded in mobilizing morale. And on the military side, this is some of the first uses of morale in a global sense. You've got these British military guys saying Japanese conscript soldiers are much more highly motivated than what we're seeing in Europe. They have succeeded in going beyond sort of Band of Brothers warrior ethics into like almost a popular army that's willing to rush machine gun nests and things like that. And they use morale, so they say that's important. They don't use the word morale for civilian mobilization, but they talk a lot about how civilians have been mobilized to support the war financially, sending troops off, spiritually, all sorts of things like that. The other thing is, 1905 is when the British Admiralty plans the blockade against Germany. That's when they first start talking about it, and they talk about the possibility of targeting like the working class of Hamburg as a way of winning. So I see those two events in different regions of the world, and I thought it'd be a cool place to start.
Especially about public opinion.
Yeah. So I don't know if I can answer it this quickly, but you're bringing up a really important point. So one of the things about these total war regimes, even if they don't seem democratic to you, even if they're like Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, that they are founded on popular support. You need them. You need them for esprit de corps. You need them to serve in the army. You need them to produce. And so there is a notion that the modern polity can only wage a war like that if they have the people on their side in one way or another. And so I think it's an important transformation. And one of the reasons why we talk about mobilization at home as well as abroad.
Okay, very good. We've got some wine that's being served over the Hildebest Dining Hall. Everybody's welcome there to continue the conversation. Thank you very, very much for coming. Most of all, thank you, Shel, for a really fantastic